We're so excited to have you here. So welcome to today's Databite about red teaming generative AI harm. My name is Borhane Blili-Hamelin, and I'm going to be hosting the conversation today. A little bit about me. I'm an affiliate with Data and Society, working with the AI on the ground team. I am also part of the leadership team at the AI Risk and Vulnerability Alliance. And before we go any further, I want to give a huge shout out to the production team making today's event possible, and that's CJ Brody Landau, Tunika Onekikami, and Iretiolu Akinrinade. So, for those joining us for the first time, a little bit about Data and Society. Data and Society is an independent research institute. We study the social implications of data and automation. We produce original research. We bring together thinkers from different fields. And we do this in order to challenge the power and purpose of technology in society. So, a little bit of framing. We're going to be spending the next hour together. Again, we're so glad to have you. But before we go any further, I want to give a little bit of context, getting ourselves situated. So, first question is, what is this conversation about? We're going to be talking about testing. We're going to be talking about testing generative AI systems, and specifically about an extremely popular and important testing approach called red teaming. And that's very roughly speaking, testing that uses adversarial methods to find flaws and problems. So, okay, we're here talking about testing. Why is testing so important? And for this, I like to start from a quote from Arvind Narayanan, who observes that traditionally in machine learning, the main thing you do is you just build models. That's the core thing. And evaluation and testing, that's a little bit more of an afterthought. But the story of machine learning recently has been models becoming much, much more general purpose, much, much more flexible. And as part of this, there's been a change in mindset on the importance of testing. So the quote is, general purpose means you build once, but you have to evaluate everywhere. You have to test in every context. You have to test in so many more ways. And that's really, where red teaming has become so important. It's because of this new requirement to test in so many more ways, in so many contexts. We have to be asking, in context, is the system doing what it's meant to do? What unintended impacts might it have? How might the system be attacked? And so on and so forth. How might the system misbehave? Okay, so that's the what. That's what we're going to be talking about. But why are we doing this now? And the backstory for today's conversation is that we just released a report. We're very, very proud and very happy to see this in the world. It's a collaboration between Data and Society and the AI Risk and Vulnerability Alliance. And what we do in the report is we draw on interviews with folks in the field, asking questions like, why is red teaming so important? Who's involved? What approaches are being used? A little bit of a teaser. So we dive into meatier questions that include tensions over the term red teaming and what counts as red teaming, the role of community-driven and gamified red teaming event and public testing, who decides what counts as acceptable AI behavior, but also whose interests are served by public involvement in red teaming. And as a last bit of teaser, I want to talk about a takeaway from our report. And this takeaway is generative AI red teaming shouldn't just be seen and thought of as a set of techniques. It also needs to be thought of as a mindset. In particular, it's a mindset that encourages holistic, contextual approach to evaluating systems. And again, on this mindset component, I just want to end with this quote from Gregory Fontenot about red teaming that I feel illustrates this mindset thinking extremely well. So Gregory Fontenot says, when you hear best practices, run for your lives. The Titanic was built with best practices. It was faithfully operated in accordance with best practices. Okay, so what is this saying? Safety and security best practices are extremely important. No one is thinking we should get rid of them. But what the quote illustrates is that a red teaming mindset about best practices brings curiosity to discovering how best practices can go wrong. And that's part of this mindset instead of techniques thinking. Okay, so this is the context. Now we're going to talk about what we're going to do today. We just released a report, and that's exciting. But we feel like this topic this topic is about the community that's shaping the practice. And so instead of just having an event about our amazing report, which we're super happy about, we instead wanted to have an event that invites people who are shaping this field so that we can discuss and think through with the community, what is happening with this practice. And so we brought together people that include, that have experience doing red teaming at scale, people that have experience shaping red teaming policy, people that have experience, doing research on red teaming, but also experience related fields like trust and safety. And so we have an amazing slate of speakers. I'm so happy to have each one of you here. And that's Lama Ahmad, Camille François, Tarleton Gillespie, and Briana Vecchione, who will be joining us. You can check the link in the chat to learn about each of them. And so to get things started with the group, I want to hear about what you each do in this space. I'm going to be asking you, each of you one by one. This is a lightning round, very, very quick. And Brianna, let's start with you.
Sounds good. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. We're very excited to have you. My name is Brianna. I'm a technical researcher at Data and Society, and my work focuses on auditing and accountability in socio-technical systems, particularly at the intersection of social justice, participatory engagement, and policy. So lately, I've been doing a lot of work on mapping the audit landscape and aiming to bring in more participatory methods from relevant fields. And in doing so, I've been exploring how participatory red teaming methods in particular can be helpful for things like harms identification and accountability.
Camille, what about you?
Sure. Thank you for having me. I'm Camille François. I'm a professor at Columbia University, and before that, I spent many years as a tech executive in Silicon Valley working on trust and safety. And a lot of my work then and now um, took a page from cybersecurity methods. It could be red teaming, could be bug bounty, and trying to adapt them into new types of problems we have in trust and safety and in AI harms. I've done a little bit of work too in attempting to translate that into sound public policy on both sides of the Atlantic with sometimes good outcomes and sometimes less interesting outcomes.
Thank you so much. What about you, Tarleton?
Hi, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. Tarleton Gillespie. I'm at Microsoft Research in the Cambridge, Massachusetts lab. I also have an affiliation with Cornell University. I'm a critical sociologist that happens to work for a tech company. I've been studying what happens when media institutions and new media institutions find they are running into public responsibilities and how they take on those responsibilities or sometimes dodge those responsibilities. I spent a long time thinking about social media platforms and content moderation and sort of the way that the question of the judgment of value turns into a process by which these decisions are made. So as generative AI emerged, there was sort of a clear link for me for thinking about evaluation and especially red teaming. So where are value judgments being made around what these tools should and shouldn't do, and how is that a public problem as well as a problem for the model designers?
And last but not least, Lama.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lama Ahmad. Great to be here today. I am a technical program manager on the safety systems team at OpenAI. I've been at OpenAI for the last 3.5 years. So yes, that was before ChatGPT was released. And we started red teaming actually even before the release of ChatGPT with DALL-E 2. I led our human red teaming efforts for almost every launch since that time. And I think it's really, really critical and very apparent that while red teaming methods are advancing with AI tools and automated methods, human red teaming is still a really core part of how we do our work at OpenAI. I think that really highlights how important it is to continue to bring in the human perspective and risk assessment and contextualizing those risks. And my work is really centered around that at OpenAI, and I'm excited to chat about that today.
So happy to have each one of you here. So the rest of this conversation and folks who are here, want to be mindful. This is being recorded. This is also going to be a podcast, but like we're very aware this is also an interactive experience. So we're going to get, to get questions from the audience. So roughly the structure from now is going to be We're going to start by discussing in depth four key topics we find especially important. That's the value of human red teaming, that's questions about labor, the work of red teaming, questions about participation and accountability, and also questions about global policy and the place of red teaming in the policy landscape. And after that, like focused block of like four key topics, we're going to get questions from the audience. And then we're going to end with the discussions of challenges in this space before we move on to closing thoughts. So, questions you want to be asking questions, please drop them in the Q&A and know that we're gonna get to them, in a little moment. But for now, we're going to start with these topic-focused discussion. And the first topic is the question of the value of human red teaming. And I'll be asking this question to Lama. So you have extensive experience organizing red teaming at scale. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on the value of human red teaming. Why is human red teaming so important?
Yeah, so we've recently at OpenAI published some work that I think touches upon this. I'd highly recommend checking out a blog post and two papers called Advancing Red Teaming with People and AI. And what I'd say is that these methods are quite complementary. At its core, we think about risk assessment as understanding what outcomes might happen that could cause harms or advance certain risks that we might care about, whether that's ranging from disinformation, understanding bias and stereotyping, all the way to risks like what happens in a chemistry lab if you're trying to use models in practice with advanced tools, and what might actually occur if you're using models in those contexts. Understanding those processes by which you reach those risks is the human part of human red teaming. I think you can come up with a bunch of examples and kind of run them over and over again over iterations on new models, new systems, ways that you might actually work in practice. And this is still a core part of how we think about things because we move really quickly. And I think it's also important to make what we learn from humans actually scalable. But I think at its core, we start with those questions of what are the risks that might matter? How do we understand, like, say with GPT-4o, we suddenly had a model that could listen and produce output in audio as well. That posed new risks compared to only images or just text in, text out. And we kind of had to think about like, what are these new risks that are posed here? And how do we actually understand and test for risks related to audio? You start with the humans. You start with basically looking at like how do people interact and taking it from there. I think that like an important part of it though is actually understanding, okay, once you have this like data set of human examples of how people have interacted with, say, a model like GPT-4o, what do you do with that and how do you actually use that in production? And I think that's something we've gotten good at OpenAI in terms of our red teaming. And we also document these processes pretty thoroughly in our system cards. So I think that's kind of how human red teaming fits in. And I think the voice example is a really good one because you can kind of imagine that people have different ways of speaking, speak in different languages with different accents, and those variations really impact the outcomes and the ways that we might interact with AI systems. And voice is just one example. There are so many permutations of this.
I love the way you emphasize the connection. So like if you're doing red teaming, you're doing testing, but the problem isn't just, what testing are you doing? It's also why does this matter? And that's the connection to the risk, to the real world threat, to the real harms that might occur. But I'd love to, like hear you dig a little bit more into this connection between like why is human judgment so important to connecting the activity of testing, the evidence you might surface during testing to like the why does this matter and to making good choices and connecting the things you do to the things you want to prevent in the world. I don't know if you can like if there's examples you like to use to like highlight like what's happening at that connection and why is human judgment so important.
Yeah, so I'll give two examples here. One is let's think about our bias evaluations or stereotyping. Understanding bias or stereotyping is not necessarily only a statistical matter. You might understand things as like, okay, how likely is this model to produce an image of a woman, man, other, But that's not enough to really understand why it matters. If I am trying to produce images of, say, a woman in hijab, I might actually care about various dimensions of like why I'm using the model to produce that image and like okay, is she wearing her hijab in a style that matters to me? Are the women in hijab that are represented from the image model in different skin tones and like different ethnicities, different groups? The variance of representation that might matter is really fundamentally human in terms of what am I actually looking for when I'm prompting a model to produce a certain output. And you only can really surface those nuances by engaging with people telling you what it is that they're looking for from an experience. And I think that's really important because if you're solely basing things on like a statistical measure, you're really kind of limiting the variation of what you could get and how you might creatively think about producing an experience that actually matches what people want to see from, say, a generative image model. The second example that I'll give is around the chemistry lab example that I gave. So, say you want to understand in the context of a chemical lab, I want to use these models and I want to use it to advance the science of the work that I'm doing. If you enter a chemistry lab, you're trained in lab safety, ideally, and you start to learn some of the rules of like what chemicals you can or can't mix, how can I actually do these experiments safely, and you may need to actually understand that context in using the models for conducting a chemical experiment. You might only be able to understand that two chemicals are not okay to mix, or you need a certain condition in a lab by talking to an experienced scientist. You might only be able to surface that that information was actually missing by understanding in practice how a scientist might use these models in the lab and what information is necessary. And so you can really only contextualize those risks, not only from okay, does this model output seem fine based on an evaluation set that I created? You might be able to improve those evaluation sets over time, but to be able to make those improvements, you really need the context from humans. I think those two examples kind of highlight different types of arms that we are interested in looking at, and where like humans come into play when you're thinking about like subjectivity of experience all the way to contextual information that might relate to a specialized domain expertise. So hopefully that those two examples illustrate some of why human red teaming matters.
This is super helpful. So we're thinking about human judgment, human red teaming being so important. The other side of human judgment and human red teaming here is also the labor component. So this is a new form of work. And Tarleton, you just recently released a report advocating for a more sociological approach to AI red teaming and thinking about red teaming, and in particular focusing on the labor arrangements behind generative AI red teaming. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on so how should people understand red teaming as a form of work?
Yeah. This comes from a paper that I co-authored with Ryland Shaw and Mary Gray and Gina Suh. And, we start with the observation that from a sociological perspective, we know way too little about red teaming, given its importance, and other forms of labor that, happen in the production and maintenance of AI models. It's why this report that's coming out of Data Society is so useful. And given that some of the stuff we know about red teaming is coming out of companies in part as a kind of security theater, and given the kind of political climate shift in the US and elsewhere, we're probably going to know less about it. And that's really dangerous. We start from a perspective that says this is fundamentally a labor question. So a lot of discussion about red team is sort of how to do it and how to design it so that it helps the tools. But we know that this is a set of people doing a very particular kind of work, and that raises a lot of questions. Who's doing this work? Where is that work happening? Under what sort of labor arrangements is that work taking shape? That raises questions about what value systems and assumptions are being brought to this process, right? When we ask, can this tool be harmful? Can we figure out before it's released or after it's released, where that harm might live? Those are immense set of questions that, as Lama said, like a set of people are bringing to the equation. But it's not just a set of people being asked to interrogate the tool. it's creating a process of work that will exist, right? This is labor arrangements. Are these internal teams to the companies? Are they volunteer groups? Are they outsourced? Are they users being enlisted? Are they specialists that are being borrowed? And part of that question also is that this is work that is not without mental health risks. And so whose responsibility is it to take care of those things? There are a lot of parallels, I think, to the emergence of content moderation. And that also was a field that when we asked what's the right judgment and, should Facebook take down this image or that image, we missed a bigger question, which was like, who's doing the work and how is that being institutionalized as a practice that will continue regardless of what platform, what problem, what harm, or what AI model, what use, what context.
What's the place of the questions researchers going to be asking about this shift in labor arrangement?
Yeah. I mean, I take, I think there are a lot of parallels for content moderation. And here's sort of three examples of things we can think of. So, most of the social media platforms, when they began building out trust and safety, they depended on internal teams. Sometimes that was hiring a team to do that role. Sometimes it was asking programmers to spend a couple hours, removing images. And yeah, most of that meant that you were starting with a kind of know it when you see it approach, right? They thought they knew what porn was. They thought they knew what hate was. And that made sense to the teams. And one of the things that took us a while to figure out was that when you do content moderation, internally, intuitively, and iteratively, there are structural drawbacks, right? So the platforms who started trust and safety using their own employees often underestimated the harms that were faced by women, by marginalized racial and ethnic groups, by those with stigmatized sexual and gender identities. And it took a long time for platforms to recognize the sort of depth and range of harms that might have exceeded the view of the teams that they were using. So to arrange the work in the way they did had consequences for what the work ended up doing. That could happen for red teaming. That is largely happening internally, intuitively, and iteratively. Then we watch the platform sort of recognize how much work this involves and do the now classic endemic move that Silicon Valley does, which is to try to outsource most of that labor. Now you've got a new set of labor concerns, right? Who's being asked to do that work, under what conditions, with what labor protections, in what nations, a huge set of questions about not what a handful of people, but tens of thousands of people are doing as their work for the platforms, for the internet, for public discourse, but largely hidden from view from users or from regulators or even from the companies. That required operationalizing all those judgments, right? Because they were supposed to happen, if you and I post the same bad picture, we should both have the same consequences. But if that judgment happened in different countries at different times by different people, so having to semi-automate the human labor that's supposed to support the automated system, and a huge set of unanticipated costs, whether that's financial costs and labor costs and mental health costs, that maybe the platforms didn't even take into account in their initial calculus, right? Like, what if this work requires tens of thousands of people? What if this work becomes its own institutionalized element of the design of these models? And the last thing I would point out is sort of the way it tangles with the public, right? So the fact that this value judgment happens, it is promised to be human, but it is largely invisible to users, to regulators. We saw with platforms come with a massive kind of wave of public frustration, whether that's frustration about why the platform won't do what you want it to do, or why you got removed, or what its sort of bias seems to be, or what its self-interest seems to be. And one thing we noticed was that not only became a liability for the platforms because that labor was hidden and sort of made to seem seamless, but was in fact a value judgment, always a value judgment, was that it was easy to politicize it, right? And the platforms couldn't say, no, we didn't do it for political reasons because the doing it was hidden. So a removal of a post saying, aha, you did it for political reasons, and I can use that against you. I don't know if red teaming will become an object of political controversy, but you could certainly see how a process that says we're delivering these models into the world, we're doing it very quickly and for very many uses, and then we are internally building a process to make sure it's not harmful, and we can't show you that process, but it's human and don't worry, leaves an incredible sort of vulnerability. And we can see, again, sort of in this moment that those kind of internal and internalized processes can be flimsy, Regulation can beef them up, but they can also be discarded when they're not politically sort of salient. So I think a lot of those lessons, if we think about red teaming as a labor practice and a value judgment that's being instituted into the building of models, then we have to ask who's doing the work, under what conditions, with what consequences.
I love that you emphasized how when you start asking these questions, you also have to be thinking about the public. And this feels like a perfect segue to the next questions we wanted to be asking, which are about public participation in red teaming, but also accountability questions with red teaming. And Brianna, you're one of the co-authors for our report, and you also do like other projects on red teaming in this space. I just wanted to ask you about this. So tell us about participation and accountability in red teaming space.
Yeah. So I would start by saying that public participation helps to address epistemic gaps because it expands these adversarial perspectives, right? So community red teaming introduces the diverse standpoints, ideally from these communities that might experience the unintended harms, but they're often excluded from the design, the development, and the deployment of these systems. And as it stands, actually, public participation is only or mostly available post-deployment as opposed to throughout the product development process. So this inherently creates a reactive approach and it limits the ability to preemptively identify vulnerabilities. And therefore, communities are often left to bear the burden of these flawed systems rather than having a voice and actually shaping those systems. And traditional red teaming often models adversarial behaviors based on like hypothetical attack scenarios. So this might not actually represent the threats that are posed by real world actors. And so if you're only incorporating technical experts for red teaming efforts, you risk overlooking some of those sociopolitical and ethical risks that emerge from real world use cases. So when you're bringing in the public, it fundamentally changes the scope of red teaming. And by broadening that scope, red teaming exercises are likely to actually better reflect real world or underexplored risks or concerns, particularly related to like structural biases that may exist, right? And so that public empirical knowledge demonstrates how GenAI systems might be misused or exploited in practice. So I would say participatory input isn't just helpful, it's actually necessary to get a more complete picture of the system's risks. And it's actually in the organization's best interest, right? Because they are able to better anticipate and mitigate risks that may have otherwise been missed by security teams who might be working more so in isolation. And then the second thing I'll say about this is that public participation serves as this like broader democratic function because it distributes epistemic authority over Gen AI risk assessment. So, traditionally AI governance has been fairly concentrated within like corporate or regulatory entities. So there's actually limited avenues for public oversight. And so incorporating these participatory mechanisms helps to counter that asymmetry. So like some examples of this, right, are things like citizen-driven red teaming. So like that's when independent researchers or like advocacy groups or communities are collaborating with organizations. And then there's also like crowdsourced adversarial testing where platforms are then inviting external participants to identify these vulnerabilities, right, like similar to bug bounty programs. The caveat here I would say is that like these models need like clear mitigation structures in order to address the risks and be accountable for identified harms. That's an ongoing challenge, and I'm happy to talk about that more.
And finally, for this like topic-focused segment, I want to hear about the place of red teaming in the policy landscape. So Camille, you combine a background in trust and safety, which is really, really central to what this practice looks like, and it's very much part of what we're thinking about. When we're writing the report, you've also worked on bug bounties for algorithmic harms, which is also hugely relevant to the questions of participation. And you also advise governments on red teaming policy. So I know for a fact you were just at the Paris AI Action Summit, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, in this context. So we're in 2025, it's a new year, it's a new setting, things are changing. What's the place of red teaming in global AI policy right now?
Yeah, thank you. But that's an interesting question because I think if I take a step back, what we've seen when it comes to the intersection of like red teaming and AI policy is a cycle that goes from hype to backlash. I think we touched on different elements of that cycle. The hype was very much this moment where a lot of regulators got really interested in the practice and started saying like we should mandate everybody should do red teaming everywhere all the time, right? And after that, we saw it come, for instance, had a prominent role in the Biden administration's executive order on AI safety. We saw it come in the discussions on the EU AI Act, where there was sort of this really focus on red teaming as something that was really going to help us solve that set of AI arms that still sounded ambiguous, right? And I think quickly after that, we moved to a moment of backlash, frankly, on red teaming as a practice for reasons that I think we talked about a little bit on this panel, right? The first thing is red teaming here doesn't really mean anything set enough. There's too many methods that will come under this umbrella. The second thing, of course, is it doesn't seem to address the accountability piece, which is what regulators care about, right? Like what happens after you've surfaced a harm. Tarleton talked about this concept of security theater, right? Like, is this just a performance? Do we just perform finding problems, but then what really happens after? And I think that actually leaves us in an interesting moment in 2025, right? Which is, okay, we've done the hype. We know it's not the answer to everything. We've done a moment of backlash, but we know people actually do this work, right? This work is continuing to happen. And we heard that it has some value. So what is it that we are talking about when we talk about red teaming? What is it good for? And what are the limits of that practice? I think that's the moment when your report comes in, and that's why it's particularly helpful, right? Is to sort of take a step back and shed a light on like what is it that we're talking about. And I'll say, um, if if we think about what's being done under the moniker of red teaming today, I'm still amazed by how many different practices we're still talking about. And there's still at least sort of three main types of folks who are doing red teaming that are pursuing widely different methods and for different incentives, right? So we heard from Lama a bit what's happening in the big AI labs. What's interesting there is the OpenAI method is actually quite different than what other big AI labs are pursuing under the auspices of red teaming. So even between those large AI labs, we don't have aligned methodologies or aligned toolings on, what red teaming entails. Then there's this booming ecosystem of red teaming vendors, right? People who are going to do red teaming as a service. And here too, Tarleton talked a little bit about this. We have very different practices from folks who are doing like automated red teaming methods to folks who are pursuing more of a BPO approach, right? With outsourcing red teaming that sort of sounds more, frankly, like what we've done in the early days of content moderation. You also have shops that have very specific expertise, right? Like, for instance, child safety and how do we think about red teaming in this context, or chemical warfare and how do we think about red teaming in this context. But, at the end of the day, like again, very different practices. And then the third set of actors who are doing red teaming and are really interesting is kind of closer to what Briana talked about, which is a community of enthusiasts and hobbyists, right? Some of that is for the public interest, and some of that is also for fun. And that sort of takes us closer to the cybersecurity hacker days, right? There's entire Discord servers of people who are going to go and break models for fun. And that's also a type of red teaming that should interrogate us on like, okay, what comes under this practice? So I'll say, and I'll try to wrap there to, leave us some space for discussion, which is it's interesting because I've seen this happen often when we bring concepts from cybersecurity into a new space. And we see that those boundaries are a little bit blurred, right? Like, what if this is more akin to pen testing or to bug bounty or to proper red teaming? And how do we sort of take a step back and conceptualize the design levers that help us understand what is it that we're talking about as programs? And not to be too nerdy about this, but I love your appendix number 1 that goes through the design levers of red teaming programs and help us understand what different types of programs we're really talking about. I'll conclude by just one thing that I miss when we think about red teaming in the context of AI is having studied the early days of red teaming for large social media and tech companies in the cybersecurity context. There was at that time almost an element of like performance art, which was also about surprising the organization itself. And it wasn't just testing the systems, it was testing the institution's ability to respond to incidents. Part of the red teaming mindset, and Bo, you highlighted this in your intro, some of that is a mindset, was also to ensure like, are your leaders ready to tackle security concerns? How are your comms processes going to hold up to something that you didn't foresee, right? And making sure that as we think about red teaming, we don't sort of lose sight of this also being an ability to test organizations' preparedness and institutional responses is something that I think remains very important and that we don't really talk about when we conceive of red teaming simply as sort of structured adversarial testing against models and not against organizations writ large.
This feels like such a good place to get into the Q&A. I want to say, though, on the design levers question, Camille, your report on bug bounties was such a huge inspiration for us. And, yeah, such a helpful way to think about open-ended problems where like you have many parameters to play with, and that is a feature of the red teaming space. The way you highlighted, there's so many things under this umbrella, and that's kind of a thread in this conversation. There's so many things under this umbrella, so many choices done for different reasons, for different purposes. And so when you go back to organizing a red teaming campaign, thinking about you're making choices, you're making them for a purpose, you're trying to achieve outcomes. How do you ensure that the choices you make are connected back to the outcomes, but also how do you think about the set of choices on the table, like in the right kind of way? And yeah, it feels like a perfect setup for the kind of questions we're getting from the audience. Um, so we're getting a lot of questions. I don't know that we're going to get to all of them, but we're going to do our best. I'd like to start with a question about the labor conversation in red teaming. And that's a question for the entire panel. Considering that the infrastructure of generative AI is centered and very, like, heavily in Silicon Valley and often US based, how can red teaming move beyond a select group of individuals? So thinking about the space of, US organizations, but also like all the different ways in which, like folks might not get to participate or shape red teaming. So, and it's a question for the whole panel. So how should people think about moving red teaming, like beyond the individuals who currently do it?
So one thing I will just say, and I'm hesitant to jump in first because I do think that like what I'm going to say might be counterintuitive in the sense that um company-led or lab-led red teaming is only one way of participating in red teaming. And I do think sometimes on the surface it seems like that's the most important way, that's the maximally effective way. But in fact, I think it's really only one way. And in the report and what my co-panelists have shared today in terms of public red teaming, really not just focused on what I do, which is pre-deployment red teaming, to really think about, as Camille was mentioning, organizational readiness, but also bolstering our policies and mitigations. That's really important. But oftentimes you learn about what happens with a model once it's in the real world. And I think forms of public red teaming, and I've been heartened to see that in contexts like DEF CON, as well as other public red teaming efforts, um, really allow for discussion of some of these disagreements in public. Like, I do think that sometimes company-led red teaming efforts, ours included, are focused on this like data gathering effort that is intended to be broad, but at the end of the day, we're limited in our time and like focus on the particular model and who we bring in. And we try to expand that through things like I started a red teaming network to try and expand perspectives of who is included in our red teaming efforts since the early days. And we kind of diversify in that aspect. But I will say that I think that thinking beyond the company-led efforts is something that I hope everyone takes away today.
Oh, I would add that, if we wanted to think about red teaming as a complex practice, I mean, I think Camille pointed to this. It's not just can someone poke the model and find a harm. It's also does that discovery get anywhere, right? So internally, there are going to be some arrangement, a successful one or an unsuccessful one, for that feedback to get up to whoever designs or could make the next change. And I think there's lots of questions about like whether in any of these companies there's going to be enough support for the kind of internal reporting to matter. We know that like we can have a practice like this, but it doesn't mean that like a design team is going to prioritize that over getting something done, right? That's a classic problem. If you want to imagine that the red teaming is going to also happen elsewhere, it can't, one model is, well, let users do it and they can sort of, upvote or downvote. It's not clear what avenue that provides for any kind of structured feedback. If it's the DEF CON model, that's amazing, but it takes resources, right? It takes resources both to conduct that, to ask people to do it, to structure the practice, and resources to get that information back to the model designers. So I think, from a kind of political economic perspective, the questioner is absolutely right. Like, it's not going to be a surprise that the parts that are left to tech companies are going to be organized in the way that makes the most sense to them, right? That may reach out to other parts of the world, but it's going to be when they see the value of that, right? Like, we need people from a different language. We need people from places where there was a controversy. If it's not going to be, if we're not satisfied with the structure that the companies themselves would provide, then there's got to be another mechanism to provide that structure, right? Regulation would be one of those. Advocacy groups would be another one of those. Civic engagement is another one of those, but those are not easy tasks. And I think it is one of those things where the old idea of people will just poke the system, like a kind of like users and hackers kind of get things done, is something that has been a powerful mythology for a couple decades, but we know where the limitations are with that. So then we do have to think about why, where's the political will and the support to build structures such that it isn't only the companies internally doing this, but that there are other mechanisms to do it, other criteria by which to do it, and other ways for that, any insights from that process to actually get somewhere and have any impact.
Another question that stands out in the chat, and this connects back to something that was mentioned earlier, which is, thinking about content moderation and how contentious content moderation practices have become. So we have someone who's asking, how do red teaming approaches account for disagreements over what counts as a harm or risk? And, like, if you frame it more broadly, like, like how do you approach the aspects of the practice that end up, like requiring judgment about what matters, what the priorities are, what the policies are, where there can be like meaningful, like very, very meaningful value disagreements. I'm burning to chime in on this. Camille?
No, that's a great question. Let me also take it to a surprising tack, which is there's also a value to fully internal red teaming as corporate culture mechanism. In a trust and safety context, I've worked with really smart red teamers. Jen Whedon, for instance, was running the red teaming program over at Niantic. And it was also interesting to see sort of red teaming as a lens on like, can we use it as a design tool and as a mean to facilitate corporate conversations on let's make sure that the builders get a space to play with the idea of unforeseen consequences from their product. And let's use red teaming as a means to facilitate those hard conversations on like, well, what is really bad? What is a scenario that we want to avoid? What is the likelihood that this scenario could happen? And what is the impact of this scenario? And so there's also something to be said for red teaming as an internal corporate muscle too, and as a facilitator of difficult conversation on precisely this question of like, what counts as a harm? What are the questions that we forgot to ask ourselves? And when in our product development life cycle should we be asking those questions? Which is again like a very different conception than like this is what we do to get other people's input, right?
Another question folks are asking is just thinking about folks and, so like workers, student workers, who find themselves in a situation where AI is being thrust upon them by authority figures, have to be using the tool. There's not enough critical consideration, and definitely not enough red teaming in context, where this is happening. So the person is asking, what advice would you give these people? Like, how do you approach a situation like this? And is there something that ad hoc red teaming can do in a context like this? Is there a place for red teaming in the setting where all of a sudden, you're faced with a deployment situation that you might not have chosen?
like the idea. I don't know if this is if you address this better in the report, please say so. But I like the idea of could we develop the vocabulary of red teaming as a response, right? So, we do have a question now about the rapidity with which these models have emerged and have been taken up into practice, and the promises that they're going to sort of like play a benevolent part in all the things that we're going to do. And that may be true in some circumstances, but then the ability for a group of people to find that the tool is insufficient for them, that one version is sort of like write an op-ed and say this is bad, but another one might be that if there was a sort of like vocabulary and set of resources to engage in red teaming as a practice, to be able to invoke that and say, let's do an exercise, right? That asks our questions, but with some systematicity, asks where it fails on certain things or what harms can be found or what measures might be taken. And that again, for that to be a powerful political response for a group of people that find that the tool is missing something for them, could be great. But again, it's a question of like, how does that become, have any agency? Like, where does that go, having done that exercise? But I like the idea of imagining that it's a practice that can be invoked, right, on a small scale and medium scale, in an ad hoc way, as a way to deliver something back to developers. That's interesting.
I think Brianna's work also talks to this a little bit, which is the emergence of people reclaiming that, frankly, a little bit of that hacker and tinker mindset and doing this collectively and publicly, right? AI systems are being thrusted upon them, and they're saying, like, I don't think this is doing what I want it to do. I feel like maybe there's a bias in the way that, whatever, my picture is cropped, to take an example. That's a real example from a participatory red teaming campaign. And asking others, is that system producing those outcomes for you? Which is interesting because here you can see sort of people playing with this idea of replicability, right? Like, can we all try the system in this way and documents are finding in public to understand if there's a harm and what exactly is the type of harm? I think that's a very healthy mechanism, for people to engage with when systems are sort of like arriving in their way. And it's this sort of tinkering in public and tinkering in a participatory way that can help us understand, like, oh, well, this is the unforeseen outcome. And to Lama's point, like, this is sort of like what it looks like when real communities, real people react to those systems being deployed.
One last question from the Q&A. We'd love to have much more time for these questions because they're so good. So someone is asking about rollbacks in AI policy that have happened since the beginning of this specific year. So in 2025, governments are rolling back AI policy. And someone is asking, do people on the panel have any comments on how these rollbacks might affect red teaming within various communities and organizations?
I will just say that, as I mentioned, we at OpenAI started red teaming even before that executive order. And, thinking that that's only one lever and understanding that that's only one lever motivation for wanting to do this type of testing. It's not to say that nothing will change and there won't be some challenges and changes ahead, but I will say that it has become almost a part of the model development life cycle for us in a very practical way, and not just in the ways of, okay, we're talking about the harms and risks and publishing about them in system cards. It actually really is part and parcel of thinking about, do these models perform well for the people that we are trying to serve? And that's going to mean a lot of things. But I will say that I think an important part of why I try to translate human red teaming to the language of evaluations and benchmarks is understanding that that is a part of like how we iterate and improve. And so, yeah, this is like somewhat addressing the question of there probably will be changes, but I do think that viewing it as a part of the model development life cycle means that it may just be essential in the ways that it's added value so far.
The other thing I'd add to that too is that I mean, to Lama's point, red teaming's happening whether or not there are regulations. And regulation allows for standardization, but companies have always done it. And so these frameworks that, regulatory frameworks can help, but they're not necessarily a necessary condition. And in thinking about this, I try to remind myself that red teaming is maybe uniquely one practice that can actually benefit from a lack of standardization right now because it allows for some freedom for us to explore possible evaluation methods, right? And we're still very much kind of figuring out how exactly genAI red teaming should be done. So I think that's important to keep in mind too.
We had a question we wanted to end the discussion with before we move on to closing thoughts, and we just want to spend some time thinking about top challenges in this space. What are the challenges that folks on the panel see as especially important and pressing or front of mind? Kemi, it sounds like you wanted to jump in. Can I pass it on to you for talking about
Yeah.
challenges?
No, I was just reflecting on what everybody was saying and thinking, agreeing, of course, that we acknowledge red teaming is a complex practice. It's sort of like it's that, hype to backlash cycle. It existed before, it will survive after. I think that the tougher question is the one that I think Tarleton you expressed in saying like, is red teaming going to become an object of political controversy? And that I think we don't know just yet. And there's this question of what will be the expectations around what you should be testing for, what types of issues you surface, and what to do about it. I think if the incentives change so dramatically, then things that are usually surfaced in red teaming is just being regarded upon as things that you can't act on or it's not desirable to address, then that brings a different set of challenges. I think that's true for red teaming. I think that's true for a lot of the safety practices right now. And we'll see how that evolves. I think that's the tough question here, in my view.
What about challenges that have to do specifically with public participation and the more like public testing forms of red teaming? Brianna?
Yeah. I think especially with regards to the public, accountability here is key. And red teaming really only drives accountability if it leads to like transparency for the public and then like subsequent change. Otherwise, as others alluded to, it's really just like a box checking exercise. It'd be performative. And it's very powerful tool for like identifying risks, right? But it's like it's not enough on its own. So and what is constantly a question we need to be asking. And I think, for it to be meaningful, both to organizations who are red teaming as well as the community, organizations need to actually like act on the findings and show that they're acting on the findings, and then disclosing the risks that are important. And so, eventually we can hopefully integrate these like red teaming structures into formal oversight structures. And again, like, public participation is essential here because without the input of the public, you may be missing a lot of these like real world harms, and we see that in practice.
I think
There's
jumping.
another thought. Oh,
Sorry, I was
there's
thinking.
another thought for me that feels so important to emphasize on like the public testing side. And for me, that feels like a bit of a misconception that I notice often in this space. So like a lot of the public feedback, public testing style exercises, the style that we saw at DEF CON, um, an observation people often make is this happens oftentimes post-deployment, therefore it can't impact the whole life cycle, is kind of the way people want to think about this question. And I think of the lesson that needs to be learned from this feature that oftentimes this happens post-deployment instead of as a challenge. So it's a feature that for the most part, oftentimes, if you want to use already deployed publicly available systems in order to do your testing, you need to reframe the question of how do you have an impact on the whole life cycle. And for me, one of the takeaways from the case studies we were looking at, including the DEF CON example, including the AI democracy projects example, and many, many, many other examples in this space. The takeaway for me there is not that you can't do it. You can't build something that has a broader impact. It's instead that you got to get creative with thinking about how to have that kind of impact So one example that's on my mind in particular, and that's coming from the ARVA side, thinking about security antecedents, having structured, categorized examples of problems, even if they're specific to a situation, once you start categorizing things in an extremely useful way, can enable asking questions about whether this problem you found in one setting also occurs. And so like the place of categorization and building extremely useful categories from examples that might come from a context is like one example ways in which folks get creative. And yeah, so like this reframing the problem of how to have an impact on the whole life cycle and think about public testing is another challenge that is very front of mind, but I also feel like folks have been doing really good work. Kemi, you wanted to jump in?
No, I was going to take it there, Bo. So you're 2 steps ahead as usual, and say like the other side of red teaming doesn't have to be, hey, we're knocking on the door of a ginormous AI lab, right? It could be, well, safety is also a system property, not just a model property, and we can build, tools to tackle the harms that we've discovered in a participatory way. I've done a little bit of work with the sort of open source AI community and folks who believe that safety too deserves open source tooling. And I think that's interesting to think about a model of agency and empowerment, right? Which is, you can go and then test systematically, uncover different types of harms, and then operate in tech environments where maybe you have the agency to go build some of the safeguards that address these harms, right? So I think it'll be important as we continue thinking about red teaming to not just think that the only avenue for these types of participatory testing is to go through those AI labs and to ask for a revisit, earlier in the product development lifecycle, specifically at the model level, right? There's a lot of different avenues for people to address, including meaningfully, some of the harms that could be uncovered by red teaming programs. And I think there's empowerment and agency in thinking about that too.
We're getting to the end of the conversation. We wanted to do one extremely rapid fire round of one takeaway per panelist. We want to hear from each of you, but let's try to keep it to 15, 20 seconds. So like, what's one thing you want, people listening, people joining us today to come away with? I'm going to start with you, Lama.
Yeah, I started with this plug, but I'll end with it too. I really think that, to plug my own work, advancing red teaming with people and AI is a really cool view into the complementary way of using technology tools plus human red teaming to make a real impact on the models. So I recommend that.
What about you, Tarleton?
Well, I think especially if we start to count on red teaming more and more, I think we have to remember that red teaming in its very design imagines harms from a user-centric point of view, right? Who is the adversary? Who's asked the wrong question? And we've been talking a lot today about kind of question harms for the public. It is a very long-standing tradition to imagine public harms and boil them down to user harms, and those are not the same thing. And so I think one of the things that red teaming doesn't help us with very much is how to ask community questions and institution questions. I don't know how we red team to say, what would a third party purchaser of this model do badly with this tool? That's very different than could I ask it to do something hateful and have it respond? So we need red teaming, and we also have to recognize the kind of like logic limitations of red teaming as well.
What about you, Brianna?
Yeah, I think I would just say that, it's especially important to consider that organizational transparency is necessary in order to motivate these accountability actions, because we have, very, very limited oversight structures. And organizations can always say, right, like they're adhering to best practices, and then withhold certain information from the public. So I think it becomes especially important to, continuously iterate with the community, in order to kind of ensure that accountability and mitigation is happening after you actually do the exercises.
And Kemi,
Yeah, I would say we talked about red teaming as a very complex set of practices, right? It's a toolbox, and there will be different applications that achieve different outcomes. And so it's fundamental to think about like what are you trying to solve? What type of red teaming are you talking about? Who's doing it and for which incentives? And then my real takeaway is everybody should read this fantastic report.
I love this list. And please join me in thanking our incredible panelists, Lama Ahmad, Camille François, Tarleton Gillespie, and Briana Vecchione. I also want to mention that the Data and Society and ARVA research project, thank you for the shout out again, was funded through grants, and we want to mention our funders. That's the Omidyar Network, that's the Brown Institute for Media Innovation, and also the Siegel Family Endowments. Recording and resources will be shared on Data and Society's website in weeks ahead. And again, thank you so much for joining today, every one of you. Thank you for the amazing question, and take care.